So with that introduction out of the way, let's now introduce the pets in our environment to some of the cattle that we'll now be working with. Here I am back on my desktop. This is that Windows 10 desktop we've been working with. And I want to show you here that on my desktop, I've got about enabling Hyper-V on the desktop itself. Now, everything we're talking about here works when you've got Hyper-V on your Windows 10 desktop, or if you're running it on top of a server. It's really your choice here. But I just want to use this as the location for deploying out a copy of Nano Server first as a guest OS there on top of Hyper-V. One of the first things we have to do here is put the DVD in the drive, the Windows Server 2016 DVD. And if we open it up here, you'll see there's a folder called Nano Server. You will want to copy this folder here onto some location where you can access it. And in fact, I've copied it here into the root of C already. So we have this copy of Nano Server, the original WIM file that contains all the code for deploying out Nano Server. We also have the packages that we can apply to Nano Server to allow it to do other functions like DNS and IIS and so on. We also, in addition to that, have right up here the Nano Server image generator commands. This is a module we'll now need to implement or add here into our copy of Windows 10 so that we can perform some of these actions that are necessary for generating those Nano Server images. Let's begin this process by coming right over here to Windows PowerShell in an elevated command prompt and go through some of the commands we need to enter in. You'll see me here kind of skip forward because some of the commands here I'll be entering are fairly long and cumbersome in getting them actually typed into the keyboard. One of the first things we'll need to do is set up your execution policy here to at least remote signed. This will allow us then to go about using the different commands we'll be working with here. The second command we need to do is import in the module that I showed you just a second ago, which will be import module, then C Nano Server, and then Nano Server image generator, and then /verbose. This will give us all the different commandlets we'll need for creating these Nano Server images that we'll be working with. You can see here that, in fact, let me just get rid of the verbose item here, that this process goes about importing in the module. So we now have access to a couple of the commandlets that are now necessary in order to manage and build the Nano Server images that we require. Let me hit the clear screen here and now choose one of those commands, which will be new Nano Server image with a fairly long list of parameters that we'll need to punch in to define exactly what this Nano Server image is going to look like. Let's create this as a standard image. Let's call this a deployment type as a guest deployment type. So we'll be creating this as an image to be installed as a virtual machine. Let's now define our media path, or essentially where all this content is so that we can then generate this machine. That media path will be in C://, and that's really the only information we need to plug in here at this point because it'll find the Nano Server folder that exists there in the subfolder of C://. From there, let's continue this process and then punch in the base path. The base path here is the base location, or essentially the folder that we want to create where we'll store all of this content for creating this VHDX file we'll then import in to create our virtual machine. So our base path here will be in that C:/Nano Server folder. And let's create a base path here of Nano Server 1. This will be the folder in which all that content will get stored as we go about generating this image. We also need to then define what kind of VHD or VHDX file we need. Let's call this our target path, where we'll punch in Nano Server again, and then Nano Server 1, and then the name of the VHD or VHDX file that we require. So Nano Server 1.vhdx. Now, important here to recognize is there's actually a bit of a strange behavior for this commandlet in terms of how you determine whether or not you create a virtual machine that's a Generation 2 virtual machine or a Generation 1 virtual machine, the older version of the VM. And the only way in which you make that determination is whether or not you create a VHD or a VHDX file here in this target path parameter. We will create a VHDX file here, which will create a Generation 2 version of the VM as we import it there into Hyper-V. If you wanted to create a Generation 1 version, you just simply remove the X and create an old-fashioned VHD file. So this is your determinant here for which kind of generation VM you'll be creating as you import it into your Hyper-V instance here in just a second. Let's continue here with one more parameter, which will be the computer name parameter, which is what we use to actually define the computer name of the machine we're about to create. That computer name, at least for this machine, will be Nano Server 1. This process then creates that VHDX file, and it should, actually if I punch in the password here, it should now create that VHDX file out of the WIM file that exists there in that Nano Server location. It's important to recognize here that as we're creating this VHDX file, the original WIM itself is not modified in performing this process. That WIM file will continue to be what we downloaded there off the DVD ISO, and we can then use it later on for the generation of other virtual machines and other VHDX files. After a second or so, you can see that the process here completes, and it provides us with a log file that includes information about what we've just created here with this Nano server instance. Let me minimize this and bring up here a copy of Explorer so we can see what we've now created. Here under the C drive and then under Nano server is the original WIM file. Again, this is the same WIM file as the install.wim, the boot.wim that you would use with the other versions or installation options here of Windows Server. This WIM file contains all the content that makes up a copy of Windows Server, which we have used as the starting point for creating this virtual machine hard disk up here, which is our Nano Server 1 VHDX. If I double click this here, you can see a copy of the WIM file, as well as the VHDX file that we created in adding in all those customizations that create the computer name and other configurations that prepare this virtual hard disk for use in Hyper-V. We can now simply import in this VHDX file to use it as a Hyper-V virtual machine. In fact, let's go ahead and do that now. Let me minimize this and bring up that copy of Hyper-V Manager. I do want to make sure here first that I create a virtual switch here, or have a virtual switch that I can use. This virtual switch I've already created in my copy of Hyper-V as an external virtual switch here, which I've named it to be the same. This external virtual switch allows this copy of Nano server and any other virtual machine sitting on top of Hyper-V to then talk to other machines that exist out on the rest of the internet. I'll be using this external virtual switch as I go through importing in this VHDX file here into Hyper-V on my desktop. So with this created, let's now create a new virtual machine with that VHDX file as its hard disk. I'll come here under New and Virtual Machine and run through the new Virtual Machine wizard here in Hyper-V. I'll choose Next and then give that virtual machine a name, so Nano Server 1, and I'll store the virtual machine in a different location. So just to keep it all confined to that same folder that we were working with before, let's actually browse here and go to the C Nano Server 1 location and store all of Hyper-V's necessary information there in that single location. I'll choose Next here and specify that this is a Generation 2 virtual machine because I do have that VHDX file. And I'll assign the correct memory here, 1 gig of startup memory using dynamic memory for the virtual machine itself. I'll set up the network connection here to the external virtual switch that we created there, and also then attach to the virtual hard disk that we created as part of that commandlet. Down here under Use Existing Virtual Hard Disk is where I can then define the location there to my Nano server location, and then attach it to the VHDX file that I created. If I choose Next and then Finish, this will go about now creating all the virtual machine objects that then associate to the VHDX file, the virtual hard disk that we just created. The final step in the process is to simply boot the virtual machine and take a look at what we actually built here so far. So let's start this VM and then connect to the VM and see exactly what it is that we've created here with our first copy of Nano server here in the environment. Nano server does pride itself on rebooting relatively quickly, and as you can see here, that boot process took just a couple of seconds to complete. This brings us to what Microsoft refers to as the recovery console. Not even just the console, but only the recovery console that we'll need to then do some further configuration on to continue the management of this VM.